Welcome back to the Personal Experience Podcast. My name is Jules Scott, and I have a guest with me today. And my guest is Wade Dreadnaught Penfold. Welcome, my friend, to the show.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. Second of all, your podcast voice is like way different than what I expected it to be. That was 10 out of 10.
So Wade has not actually heard me podcast before. We've been friends for probably now about a year and worked together for about a year. And he hasn't experienced this side of me, so we're gonna shock him into fun, which is gonna be amazing. Because here's the thing, you guys have probably heard his voice out there for a long time in different respects, but there's probably a lot of you who don't know who he is. So I'm going to put him on the spot and I'm going to make him explain a little bit of who he is and what he does. So Wade, who are you? What do you do?
I am, I don't know. That's a good question. What I've done, that maybe for some reason, some of you may know me out there. I am the ex-team captain and shot caller for the old Tempo Storm roster in Heroes of the Storm, who later then moved to be a commentator and one of the more premier commentators for the Heroes of the Storm community from that point on. Since then, commentated Apex Legends and a little bit of Rocket League and Battlerite as well for those who know about Battlerite, and, you know, huge credits to those who do. It's still a beloved game of mine. But then, and then later moving over to working at Wisdom, and I have a title that seems to constantly change, so I'm not even going to throw it out there, but I try to make really cool video game content for the most part. Yeah,
and you've also been a Twitch streamer. You've done that, I would say, on a professional level for some time.
No, I did. Like, I definitely earned enough, if that's your status of what makes you a professional, and it was my main source of income for some time, so yeah. I think that's fair.
So the reason why you're here, Wade, and the reason why I wanted to talk to you for this episode of the show is your personal experience is pretty vast in the world of communication. And that is something that I really wanted to talk about from someone who actually has been paid to do this for a living. Because, I mean, you know, like podcasters, yes, but a commentator, a caster, and someone who has performed on major stages, and, you know, like, you haven't talked about exactly like where you've casted. You know, we're talking like world championships. We're talking Twitch rivals. We're talking big stuff here. It's not like you've got 5 people watching you.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough. You know, if you want to go more in detail, I think it's like 3 BlizzCons, a lot of international like dream hacks and things of the like, for multiple games now, at this point, and even some of the bigger LAN events that existed in the past for Apex. So yeah, I've definitely been lucky enough to be able to try to learn how to speak for a bigger audience than maybe your average classroom.
Yeah, and I will say, I'm going to probably put words in your mouth here, but I'm going to say that this is not as easy as it looks. Am I correct?
I mean, yeah, that's for sure, for a lot of different reasons. But it definitely is not. You know, I think, and maybe I'm incorrect on this, but how it looks from the outside perspective is you just throw on a microphone and learn to basically narrate whatever's happening in front of you. But right. That is not what is happening in the world of commentary. It's an element, a fraction, but definitely I wouldn't even argue anywhere near the majority.
So what really does go into learning how to commentate a game on a stage with a large audience and a very opinionated audience who leans on every word that you say?
Well, I would say the first thing that goes into, you know, being a commentator is definitely a lot of studying. Both of the players that you're going to be talking about, but also the vernacular that you're going to be using in the game. A lot of people fail to realize that commentators can't use the average layman terms for abilities and things like that. And maybe my culture kind of growing up in gaming was a little bit more sweaty than your average Joes, who cared less about like formal spell names. But that would be an area where you have to learn a lot of, is like, rather than saying the Q of a character, you have to know the actual name of that ability and some of the actual in-game kind of thematic branding around it, to be able to make sure that every audience member has the opportunity to understand what you're saying. Because if they don't in that moment, they have the chance to easily Google it and figure that out.
Yeah.
So I think that would be like my first, what is very different than what a lot of people would expect. I think the first thing I noticed when, you started speaking and your podcast voice is your cadence.
Yes.
Is another thing a lot of people overlook. You can't just, speak through standard conversational speak. And I think, a grand example of that is like, for instance, even right now, I'm speaking kind of free flow of my mind and just really throwing out whatever comes to my train of thought. But that is usually very overwhelming, especially for an audience member who's not as well versed in whatever you're discussing. So you shouldn't be, in theory, targeting the audience that is most dedicated to your game, even though that is something that should be considered when how you discuss and especially analyze the game itself. But in reality, for esports and a lot of just broadcasting in general, you want to be shooting for the widest audience, as long as it isn't detrimental to your core audience.
How detrimental do you feel like it is so there's a line when you're doing esports casting where you're kind of inside the know and so we'll use Heroes of the Storm terminology to go back a little bit. But if someone's like, oh my gosh, look at that mosh. And you don't know necessarily as a new player what that actual ability is. But as someone in the know and someone in the scene, you've said that, and now everybody who kind of like knows that you are part of the scene, they relate to you. So how much of that is like, where's the line? And where does it become like a detriment where you're talking about, oh, his Q ability or his E ability versus actually using the names and feeling like you're separating yourself from the scene?
That's actually something that I don't know if that's been, I don't think it's clearly defined. And I think that changes based on probably the size of the game. And also, I mean, to some extent, the narrative of the developer, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who kind of control a lot of like how you speak about their game and should be the ones guiding a lot of the ways that you kind of talk about those things. But even I struggle, even within the past 6 months, I've done an event where I talked about a character's ability to basically withdraw from the battlefield for a short period of time and talked about it as an iframe, which an iframe, for those who don't know, is basically an invulnerability frame traditionally in the fighting gaming community, when you would look at the frames of the fighting moves themselves and be able to basically manipulate them in a way that would gain an advantage, invulnerability being a pretty extreme and drastic one, but still, in fact, an advantage to gain. And so I called it an iframe. And in theory, it's multiple iframes, and it's not just the sense of invulnerability. So it's kind of misapplied, but the core processes and advantages from it do translate. And that audience actually ripped me apart for it.
Did they?
They definitely weren't my biggest fan. They were like, what the heck is an iframe, and why does this kid keep talking about it? And with that, like, I still struggle to look at that moment and go, was I terribly incorrect by isolating this to such an extreme and kind of specific term, or was I in fact doing it justice to some extent because it was a better way to basically condense a massive amount of information to a more common term used in some of the gaming elements? I think, with that many people being vocal about it, it's probably more so the former, not the latter. But I don't think it is a clearly defined thing or an easy thing to be able to know when that line is. I can definitely tell you, that's why I was highlighting, understanding the game itself and the traditional names of the abilities is super relevant, because I would say if you aren't at least doing that, then you're already going to be kind of off the mark. Like in the case you gave of the mosh, yes, it is not saying the spell, for anybody who doesn't know, is a mosh pit. But mosh in and of itself is so core to the theme of that character, and also at least half of the formal name of the ability, that I would say that passes the test, for me. But then again, at the end of the day, it's actually the developer, to some extent, has the probably biggest hand in whether or not that should be or is not okay.
Yeah. And what you're talking about, where people are like, what is this kid saying and why is he saying it? I think that one of the biggest things that I have seen in just talking to you and getting to know you on a personal level is how heavily scrutinized you can be, and all casters can be, by the way that you convey yourself and the knowledge that you convey. And I feel like it is like, if you don't have what they would call the thick skin, it can really, really take you down.
I mean, yeah, I think, yes, for anybody who is maybe in a position like that, I've always used, I don't even know where I picked it up. It may have been, I don't know, maybe a famous quote out there that I just, attributed to other situations later in my life. But it was basically give the comments as much thought as the comment took itself.
Yeah.
And so, no flame to Twitch chat. We love you. But at the same time, you guys are probably some of the more savage critiquers when it comes to feedback on the internet. And so often thinking about, between them, a Reddit post, a Twitter comment, if they're well articulated and it seems like the effort was given on behalf of the, contributor, I would say then definitely take the time to maybe give it as much back. But for the most part, yes, things will be quickly negative, especially when they're different. That's something in general that people on the internet seem to not be that big of a fan of.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can remember going back into my early days of podcasting. I have a pretty significantly, I don't know, different laugh, I guess. It's loud. When I'm really laughing, it busts out. And I've had people criticize me about my laugh. And I bring this up, and if you've been a longtime listener of my podcast, you've heard me bring this up a few times because it really stuck with me when people criticized something that was at my core. I can't change how I laugh, right? Can you talk about anything like that where you've it is core to who you are as Wade, and people are just like, dude, no.
I think how I approach thinking and breaking down a game is something that I've had some people maybe have a little bit more qualms with, and to me, to be frank, it feels so natural and foreign to think of things in any other thought process that it's hard for me to be able to be comfortable with it. There's a lot of, for me, it's digesting and breaking down some of the more simplistic elements and mechanics of a game and maybe some of the common relationships of them. And really just going through a checks and balances system to some extent, or maybe not checks and balances as much as kind of an if then statement.
Yeah.
Where, if case A, then result C, if result C due to case A, then it leads to, kind of a network of results. That's how I analyze games, which I find so natural that I think some of the ways that I talk about why something exists in a certain manner, it's especially easy for, people who want to be in the know about the game and, kind of express publicly their expertise on it, may instantly go to and be like, why would you ever consider these factors or these elements when, it's clearly their own kind of assumption of what is happening at the game. And for me, that's, like I said, it's actually so foreign that I don't even know how to begin approaching considering some of the ways that it's talked about. But I'm lucky in the fact that I don't think I have any extreme natural tendencies other than common natural tendencies when you become more of a formal public speaker. For instance, again, going back to what I was talking about earlier with cadence, this is not if you want to speak professionally, your cadence is going to be a lot more dense than people traditionally would want. And so you need to be able to, basically shovel out your sentences at a specific pace so that everyone consuming it has the opportunity to understand each word rather than just vomiting and just going at it the same way that I kind of am now. And that's more of what it's like to be in the space and natural misplays, if you will. I don't think is something that's innate to me as much as it is human nature.
Right. And how much do you think that you had to change your natural cadence from what you would say normally to becoming the actual commentator caster that was, considered to be professional?
I think less than most people.
Really?
Actually. Yeah. And this could be me tooting my own horn and liking my own commentary.
Please do.
Which
because I love it.
I think it's I am really lucky in the fact that, some people may hate it about me, but there is a surprising amount of people that seem to enjoy my natural enthusiasm for things. And that it's been described to me at moments as contagious. And because of that, that's almost been a very innate strength of mine that I've been able to rely on, that I think can take away from broadcasts as long as it's kind of tempered at the right moments, it's okay. But if I just naturally was myself the whole time, I think it would be extremely annoying and frustrating. But for the most part, my cadence and some of the things that I do in commentary, I think I am lucky that seem to work in my favor rather than directly against me.
Yeah.
Just learning how to maybe control the positives and not being oversaturating would probably be the best way to put it.
There was a time where you shared with us a series of photos that you tweeted of you reacting to hype moments and how physically into it your body gets, between climbing up on the desk, like face down, like draped over the desk, hands on your mouth. And, I personally find that to be enthralling. Like, it is so interesting to watch a commentator who is totally into it and is so happy, but you can't, there has to be highs and lows. There has to be cadence, or you're going to have the moment where, like, dude, you can't be at a 10 the entire time.
Yeah.
Do you feel
like when everybody's great, nothing's great kind of thing?
Yeah, but like, do you feel like at the end of a show when you do a broadcast, are you physically exhausted?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And again, that's because like I'm the weirdest commentator that I know, in the fact that when every commentator has something that they adore about what they do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say I'm the only one, but in my experience from having, deeper conversations with some of my peers, I'm the only one that I've seen that actually the gameplay is what gets me going. Yeah. The appreciation of the actual game itself. And now I think a lot of people, I think one of the more common narratives that you'll hear on like what gets you going is like the story of the players, and being the people to be able to convey those stories and tell what are heroic moments for these individuals to the audience, and being that messenger is such an honorable and kind of beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. Not saying that I don't value that at all, but for me, my core, like what gets me going is, but what if they had done this 0.25 seconds earlier, and like what that would have led to the possible outcome of the game, and the relationship that the decisions made at each and every moment eventually lead to what feels like an inevitable result when looking at them kind of individually. And really watching those things be tested, pushed, and at times contradicted by some of the best players in the world is what gets me going. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I can kind of, again, because that enthusiasm seems so natural, kind of ride the wave is what it feels like when things begin to break the mold of what I consider to be even possible within a game. I'm awestruck. And that makes me take a minute and like really think things over. And that challenge of what can be or what is held as true from an analytical standpoint really makes me enthusiastic. And I just want to run a million miles a minute. And often my mouth does as well. But for some reason that, again, has been something that could be more beneficial. And so, yeah, I stick a lot to that. And I think that excitement, I'm lucky that people, for the small amount of people that have, listened to me, seem to enjoy it.
Yeah. I think, one of the things that I've always felt about you before I met you and before I even got to know you is that your authority always comes through in when you speak, and not just in casting, but just seeing you speak in normal worlds. But I have a feeling, and I know this already, but I have a feeling that it has possibly gone wrong for you, because in times where people have misunderstood that your authoritative tone and your strong opinions on subjects makes it sound like you're angry.
Yeah.
So how does that go wrong for you? What happens for someone who is authoritative and who has a strong voice? What is that like for you?
I would say, I don't know. And I don't want to sound too much of like a victim. But I think the most basic way to be able to put it would be, I often feel, especially with strangers, that my conversations are like have to be walking on eggshells. And I think that's a mixture of like, I have a rather direct approach to communication a lot of times, and then mixing that with maybe some of the stereotyping around like what it means to be an authority figure, causes it to be very easy to look at what I say and see negative connotation behind it when it feels, especially from my perspective, as matter of the fact might sound too abrasive, but where it feels almost objective, where, especially in times where I am genuinely doing, as much as I physically can to be not emotionally riddled in my response or my perspective on something. It is weird how often it's like, all right, so take everything you're about to say, cut it in half in terms of gravity or, kind of magnitude, and then try and throw it out there in the world. And maybe you will better have your message kind of, heard, or your intent heard.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, I've personally seen it happen with you, where you've been stating something and it is matter of fact. There is no ill intent or anger or emotion that is stronger than I'm just stating this coming out, and it is misinterpreted or taken wrongly, and you feel like you have to do damage control. And I know people like you. I've met other people like you who have literally had to change how they present themselves to the world in order to not ruffle feathers and make others feel like they're going to be threatened or intimidated. Yeah. And do you feel like you've had to do that over time to really kind of change your core of who you are with communication on the first meet?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. There's like a stubborn part of me that, like, a great example of, like, lessons to learn to be a human being that maybe comes off as abrasive is the sandwich technique. And that's probably effective for like everybody, right? Mm-hmm. Is like, you hit them with the compliment, you hit them with the criticism, and then you hit them with the compliment again. And it's like, by layering it through this positivity, you will have less of a psychological kind of negative impact on the person who's receiving the message. Right. And I definitely have, taken notes and bits and pieces from that, and at times will definitely try to make that happen. But the stubborn part inside of me also goes like, how far do you have to shift the form at which you communicate before it becomes disingenuous to yourself?
Yes.
And so for me, I think I probably, for better or for worse, stick a little bit more close to my more natural tendencies, at least in terms of how direct I am, and not skewing around those things. But I do think that, at least when it comes to the tone and some of the wording, I think is actually probably the wording is probably the stuff that I adjust the most. And I think that's mainly because a lot of culture and communication seems to be heavily dependent on connotation, not what's being said in a literal sense.
Yeah.
And when using any kind of terminology or wording that is a little bit more exact, it feels as if that is coming with a level of negativity.
Yes.
And so that I've learned by trying to say the same message with things as less specific and less, I think, thorough of a thought process behind it, even if that thought process is there, is probably the biggest thing that I've at least learned from my experience in trying to, work in larger groups.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, so I ran into this in a younger age as well. And, I know I'm like you in this. I don't want to be like, I'm bragging myself, but I was always an intelligent kid, and you were an intelligent kid. And I think what happens with intelligent kids is that we just go ahead and forge with what we know and what we see and how we see it. And there are people who are threatened by that approach. Like, I've had people to tell me, like, don't use such big words, or say that in English. Like, and I mean, when I met you, we had this conversation where it was like, I kind of just looked at you and I was like, I get you. Like, I understand you. You and I have totally different personalities and different communication styles. But I took one look at you and I said, I get you, because I know where you come from in terms of challenges with communication. But I would like you to try to help somebody who maybe hasn't had the opportunity to run into someone like you, or they are you, and to help them understand what it is, what are your challenges to be understood, and when you are misinterpreted incorrectly.
I think, to be honest, if I had like one, I don't know if it'd be advice as much as a way to be able to frame the thought process around the topic, was given to me by a good friend of mine, Kevin Cloakin Johnson. He
Cloaking.
he told me about some advice that he'd gotten as a young man that really stuck with him about the burden of communication and who it relies on. And that in reality, I think that most of the people with these communication challenges and maybe a little bit more direct on things often look at the situation and fail to understand why they need to change on what feels like on the behalf of somebody else's failure.
Yeah.
But understand that communication, especially in kind of Western culture, puts you in a position to where the burden is on the speaker. And that if you, in your words or whatever the medium that you actually are exchanging with the human being and the intended listener, cannot get that communication across in the manner that you would like to do so, that is your burden to solve, not the listeners. And when you can internalize that and know that, number one, that's the cultural and kind of linguistic norms, but then also in the fact that if you are trying to be able to make anything that takes more than kind of a one-man band situation, you have to learn those things in order to benefit you, not them. Even though in the moment I think it's easy to get emotionally kind of blinded and feel as if you're giving up a sense of yourself for others, when in reality you're giving up a sense of yourself to get what you're trying to make happen.
Yes.
And given enough time, I would even make the argument that if you can showcase those abilities and functioning in those groups and build things that are of note, then quickly you can probably find that your kind of speaking practices can become a bit more natural, and they'll often be better received. It is just in groups where you fail and in circumstances where you fail to be able to have enough evidence to basically, or time, to build a sense of trust, then natural social practices are going to remain true.
Yes.
There are no exceptions for you until you can build that trust independently with those human beings. So just understand that, I think more than anything, that internalize the idea that it's actually more for you than it is for them, even though it's easy to, again, become emotionally blinded. And maybe that was just my, kind of naive, ignorant, self-focused kind of perspective growing up. But that was probably the most common one that I felt and would feel frustration over for longer than, just 5 minutes after a conversation.
Yeah, because you're trying to get an idea across and the person is not receiving it for whatever reason it is. And it is highly frustrating. And then it feels like I think the natural response is to go, well, it's their fault because they don't get me. They don't understand me. And with what we do,
I think it's definitely the easy response.
It is the easy response.
Yeah.
And what we do in the work that you and I do all the time is we're talking to such a diverse and just crazy different group of people, is that you can't come running at the same problem with the same approach every time, because you're not taking into account the diversity of the audience.
Yeah. And even, I think, due to the diversity and the amount of time that it takes to be able to appeal, and have conversations with maybe that quantity of human beings, it's also, again, like the lack of evidence or time to build a sense of trust. And I personally think, like, on a, communication level, trust is a huge factor that people often overlook when it comes to communicating, because you have to be able to communicate with absolute strangers with a very limited amount of trust. But even those communications are coming with some ounce of trust, even though you may not realize it. And the fact that you trust that the human has the same symbolic representation of each word in the English language as you do, which means that your words would then be accurately kind of translated over to them when speaking to them, and that you are holding some things to be true in the world of what you are trusting this human being to have or not have. And usually we default to a positive intent out of most people and human interactions that we actually have. Granted, that's not a true blanket statement, but you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so that trust actually, I think, digs a little bit deeper and is a little bit more prominent than you would recognize at first glance of, like, what were the elements at play during that conversation.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, very recently, I had an experience where I was working with someone and very much not able to communicate without emotions getting in the way. And it was difficult. It was very difficult because I was I kind of pride myself on being able to work with different communication styles. And this particular person, I could not seem to break through just the antagonistic feeling of just like, we're not syncing here. We're not getting on the same page. And the way that I had to change that and the way that I had to manipulate the situation to make it so that we were not antagonistic was to prove that we were on the same side. And that we were both, like, as you said, both human beings working towards the ultimate goal, and that we're not actually trying to tear each other's hair out to reach that goal. And I don't envy someone who, like yourself, who has an authoritative voice and authoritative tone, that when you speak and you say, no, this is what I'm trying to say, that you're automatically, people are going to bristle just because some people just don't like authority.
And I mean, to be honest, I'm one of them, so it's kind of ironic.
Well, shit. I mean, how do you overcome that?
I mean, okay, so let's frame this question a little bit again, just so I know exactly what's being asked. So, like, how do we overcome being naturally maybe authoritative in at least how we're interpreted, right?
Yeah. And emotionally reactive to a statement without, like, you have no intent of being like antagonistic, but your authoritative tone is just your natural speaking. And someone who does not react well to authority is now just back against the wall to you.
Yeah, I think much like you were highlighting in your example, I think that's more of like a singular technique to the same element that I'm going to convey here. But it would be, I'm going to use gaming terms here because I'm a nerd. But it would basically be when the rules of the game in and of itself are changing, it is a flawed mindset to bear, and stick with your original game plan, because the assumption of what the game was when that game plan was instilled is no longer a true statement. And to basically hold true something that's built off of a false assumption at this point, and we know that clearly, is basically a suicidal game plan. Mm-hmm. So you need to be functioning and understanding that if the rules of the game itself are changing, and that just being the conversation and the two minds kind of interacting with one another, and that you can't work with the original game plan, and it seems like the pitfalls maybe come down to some of the emotional disturbance there, then it is in your best interest in every way, shape, and or form to then be functioning under the mindset that the emotions are the win condition, if you will. And when the emotions become the win condition, then you need to be catering to them. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that you need to bend over backwards and again not be yourself, but understanding that in order to find an opportunity to be successful and have a positive relationship with this human being, and it seems as if their emotions are something that are heavily influential, then you need to be able to learn how to influence those in a positive gesture in order to better further that relationship.
Yeah.
So just really, I would say it's like playing to and like shifting into the mindset that is necessary. Like, it's like in college, I studied a little bit of psychology, and some of the elements of psychology that I always found so interesting, and I found it foreign, how foreign it seemed to be to most people, was working with like, serial killers or some of the most, basically any human being, a mind hunter that you're like, man, I love to, see this. And it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
But when you're given the opportunity to kind of empathize, genuinely empathize, and if you are able to empathize with them, it's clear that their thought process and emotional structure and other elements are very different.
Yep.
And when you work through that process, through their rule set for their game, you quickly can understand how such a radical, and most people would argue terrible thing that from your original standpoint was from theirs reached a point of logic. Mm-hmm. Even though you may not agree with that logic, you can understand the outcome that kind of came at hand. And to me, it's again one of those, like, when the emotions or something is very different in the circumstance, if you can empathize with them, which in that case originally was the emotions, and now maybe the lack thereof when it comes to the serial killer, that the logic systems will change. And when you can play or think and empathize under those same ones, then learning what the game plan and building that new game plan becomes a lot easier. and a lot less terrifying.
Yeah.
And so I've always, adored studying and looking into some of the thought processes of those human beings. And I think for me, part of the drive to that was how often people would negatively react and just be like, how can you believe like what this human did, right? Like, and how unapproachable it is. And it's like, I mean, when you take any amount of time to, I can actually pretty quickly. It doesn't take too much of like learning of, Dahmer or somebody of the like in their background to understand maybe some of the elements that maybe cause them to think that this made sense.
Yeah. This is why these reality shows and the podcasts exist for true crime, or like I watch a lot of stuff that is personal studies of people who have some severe mental health issues. So I watch things like Hoarders and Intervention and my 600-pound life.
Yes,
because I want to understand, and we all do, where we kind of think about it as like, I don't know, is it like the train wreck, we can't look away thing. But a lot of us have that natural curiosity to understand something that we don't personally actually experience ourselves.
Yeah. And I think even then, I would say, I think the natural desire, especially due to the radical elements around some of those situations, like to kind of be able to empathize is really true. But I would even argue, not saying this is the case with you, but I would argue with a lot of the people consuming those same media channels, I'm not confident that they're actually effortedly trying to empathize with that human being.
Yeah. I agree.
I think it takes a lot more. I've said this before somewhere in another conversation with a human being on the internet somewhere. But it's basically, when it comes to communication, we often feel as if learning how to speak is the hard part. And that's where I would confidently tell someone that they're incorrect. It's actually listening. Takes a lot of energy and effort because of the emotional bond that it's asking you to build on to that human being. And so even when it feels as if your communication problems are actually, this is my tip to that human being, to answer the last question rather than, framing it and working it through those different things, I would actually say, learn what it takes to listen, and then you'll understand how to better speak. Because if you're truly listening to the human being and attempting to empathize with them effectively, you are then understanding again, for the gaming kind of reference, the rule set and the things that are actually driving elements to their arguments and their stance. And by doing and understanding those things, you will better be able to frame what you're actually trying to convey, even if it is equally as direct.
It's also very, very poignant for casting and commentating, because if you're not listening to your co-caster or your host, you're not going to follow where they're going. It is going to cause a break in the continuity. And it's going to make it sound like you've just got some ego that you're just kind of heading off, or you're just not paying attention.
Yeah, and I would say, I'll be honest, you'd be surprised how many commentators actually aren't listening, but they've learned a technique to be able to basically come back from a statement you say and make it seem as if they were.
Yes.
Like, it is actually probably one of my biggest gripes with being a commentator, is how little most commentators actually listen to what is being said. And I understand there's a million things going on. Production could be talking in your ear. You're trying to talk about the game, think about how you're going to present your next thought. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on. But it's actually, I would say, almost more common than not to learn some of those. If I just take the back end 3 words that you said and say, but yeah, and then over here, something else, it makes it sound like I was listening. I wasn't. I was just trying to figure out what I was going to say that whole time. I just learned how to gracefully make it appear as if your average viewer thinks I am, and that there is some air quote, kind of continuity there.
Well, I knew you were listening to me because you referred back to my actual question. So, you've already proven that you're better. So there you go.
I mean, that might be fair. I would say there are not nearly as many moving parts in this podcast as there are broadcasts. So
Agree.
I just want to highlight that to everybody. If you listen to this, you start watching your favorite commentator and realize that they have some of these traits, just understand that it doesn't make them a terrible person, especially depending on their experience and the level of production, broadcasts, and a million other things. That there are a lot of things happen during a traditional esports broadcast.
Yeah. And one of the things you'll also know, I guess I'm going to put words in your mouth, is that Wade is also one of the most humble people that you will ever meet, even though, you may think that he's got this big ego and he knows all of this stuff. He will actually take everything and turn it so that he does not, like, I don't want to sound like this. Please don't make me sound like this. So I'm putting that in your mouth because I want people to know that about you. I think that it's important because when someone has an authoritative voice and an authoritative speaking and knowledge, it can be misinterpreted that that they think you have a massive freaking ego. And I don't want them to have that with you.
Yeah, it's weird how consistently on a very limited amount of interactions that I have with someone, how often it is that I am the know-it-all, and how frequent it appears, like with anybody that I have long-term, or not even, I would say just medium amount of interactions with, how most come off kind of with the perspective that you have.
Yeah.
To be honest, to me, just I always feel like I'm accurately evaluating myself, which is like I'm just a dude who talks about video games. Like that's a joke, I used to make on my stream, is either I'm a dude just trying to win the video game or I'm a dude just trying to talk about video games. And that's, I shit you not, how I feel. And so it's hard and weird sometimes when people kind of glorify me beyond that, even in the same cases that you've done here. Like I understand it, and I don't think it's like, why are you saying that or anything else, as much as it is like, from my perspective, I'm trying to admit how innate my point of view seems to be when talking about myself. So it is weird how contrasting those groups of people are from one another, to where probably because it's the easier route, I like to think that I'm not the worst human being in the world. But who knows? To be honest, who really knows? So
I mean, we all kind of hope that that's the case, and we strive for that. But that is the downside of putting yourself into the public eye, is that there is open for scrutiny. And like, I remember watching your stream when you were streaming regularly, and the personality that you have on stream is so much more you, which I know now. But then it was more like, that's not the Dreadnaught that I see casting, and it's really kind of messing me up.
Yeah, and I don't know. I would say almost all of your commentators are not the same person that what they are in their own personal brand, and who they are when the camera's off is not the same what you see up on stage. And I think that's such like anybody who puts themselves kind of out there for what is a performance feels that way.
Yep.
But I would argue it's probably even I don't know, that's unfair. I don't watch or do enough other art forms that would be considered a performance to really be able to say if it's more common in esports. But I do feel like a lot of people overestimate their one-sided relationship and their understanding of who that person really is.
Yes. Even with streamers too.
I think even more so with streamers, because the amount of hours that you actually see them outputting on their stream, you often feel like you have a solid understanding of who they are. And I think it's purely off of sample size. You feel like you're better to be able to build that trust with them, right? Mm-hmm. Because of pure exposure to them, which makes you increase in your confidence of who they are as a human being. But much like everything on social media, even that upon the world of Twitch, there is something else happening when the camera's turned off, and you have no way to gauge those things whatsoever.
Yes.
And I think the worst thing about that process is that often, because you have no other way to gauge them, you can only look at other people that typically have the equal level of exposure to the outside world. And what I mean by that is like basically other streamers, to be able to convey whether or not that human being is a positive or negative thing or accurate to what they are. And in most of those cases where they do have the same amount of exposure or kind of common ground on something other than maybe their personalities, it's typically in their best interest to convey as if that human being is also a positive experience in big things. Because the last thing you want to be doing in that situation is basically planting your flag down and being like, I have a problem with this human being, when you don't really have maybe any evidence or anything to talk about and to justify to your audience why maybe you'd be separating from doing with that human being. It just makes more sense to just go with the flow until something else displays itself. And so the only way to really gauge social success, if you will, or maybe the actual emotional standing of the person that maybe you feel like you have a strong relationship with, is to truly be a person who has a strong relationship with them. And that's where, Twitch chat isn't alone in the fact that, music artists, movie kind of stars, like it's a very common negative relationship that we kind of build with those humans.
And it's also, the one thing I think in closing to think about with this is that, like, Wade is a human. I'm a human. Every person that you've watched on any movie, TV show, Twitch streamer is a human. And there's a human behind that. And to remember that the person that you see on that performance and the thing that they're doing isn't truly 100% them. There's more to them than just that. And because I can't remember how many times people have said this to me, and I know that they've said this to you, where they've met you in person, hear your voice coming out of your mouth and just get kind of disconnected from that. Like, I've heard your voice for so long and now I'm watching it come out of your mouth, and it's the weirdest thing for me.
Yeah.
And I, as the human being, go, this is really weird. Like,
yeah, and you're like, I don't know what to say to that, but thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully you still like what you see. I'll be here all the time when I'm not on the mic, for real. If you want to hang out, if not, it's chill. You can do you. It's hopefully you don't hate me now.
Exactly, because now you actually see how it all comes out of me. Like, it's the real thing. So yeah, treating and understanding that the casters, the commentators, and everyone who you've talked to in that communication is communicating to you in their way, but they are a human behind it, and that they have feelings, and that they that it is a little weird when you're like, a lot of things that have happened that I know is interesting is, like, because you've shared things about your life or that you've done in your experience, there's a one-sided relationship where the listener knows more about you than you know about them when they meet you.
Yeah, and it's always like, awkward, because typically those who know more feel, again, more validation in their ideas about who you are supposed to be, which only makes it that much more challenging to be anything but that.
Yes.
Which then again leaves it at like, all right, well, this is the way it is, so hopefully you don't hate it, because I'm not, doing my normal thing right now, and so I'm not gonna like try and become the human being that you think I am, just to be able to please you in this kind of conversation or in this environment now.
Yeah.
It's always it's basically a coin toss, to quote one of my favorite rappers, long live your idols, may they never be your rivals. Because you get to learn a lot more about them in those situations, and they might not be the one-sided relationship you built them up to be.
Yes. Hi, Elvis.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. That is the wonderful Albus in the background. Get to hear him a couple times a day. And I think that's actually a perfect place for us to wrap things up. Wade, thank you so much for sharing your experiences about communication as a career and in life. You're a gem, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share a little time with you to share those experiences with others. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's no problem at all. I just hope, like many of the things that I do on the internet in modern day, I just hope it helps somebody somewhere, even if it's just merely gaining a fraction of a perspective, hoping that it's something that's useful. But other than that, yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm just gonna keep doing me, just hope it works out.
Well, if Wade's words did have an impact on you, could you please tell them where they can find you and let you know that impact?
Yeah, I would say probably the best place. Honestly, if I somehow made a profound impact, you can always message me on a DM. My DMs are open on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Wade Penfold, just my name. You'll see the name Dreadnaught there. I would say that's probably the best place if you want to know what the heck I'm doing in modern day, especially because I'm less the face of some of the content that I'm making or working on or anything alike, and more kind of behind the scenes. That's where maybe you might get some of those thoughts. But yeah, and I guess, for anybody who's maybe like, wants to understand a little bit more of maybe what I've said or anything alike, again, feel free to message me there. I'm not the fastest to respond all the time, but I usually get to it eventually. So
Perfect. And please don't be afraid to message him. Like, don't feel intimidated after all of this, because I think it is the
It's
natural.
ironic.
Yeah, I know.
Is all it is.
It was like, after all this, like, oh man, I want to tell you how great this was, and I can't because I'm too scared. Please don't. Please tell him, because it's important. We need to hear this stuff too.
No, if you tell me that you liked it or it made a positive impact, I'm going to be the negative Nancy whose ego is too big and lets you know that you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to say and that I know better than you, and some other contradictory element to any of the things that I discussed here.
Well, the real Wade Penfold just stood up. There we go.
Sorry, not sorry, kids. Do kids still say that nowadays? That might be outdated. I might have just showed my age. We might want to cut that. I don't know.
No, because if you're old, then I'm ancient, and then we can't cut that. So, Wade, thank you so much for being a part of this show. We'll see you guys next time. Have a great week.
See you next.
I want to thank Wade again for taking the time to join me for this really fun episode about communication. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And if you would like to nominate a guest or suggest a guest for this show, or suggest a topic that you'd like me to cover on the Personal Experience podcast, you can reach me and the show in a few different ways. You can reach me by email at personalexperiencepodcast@gmail.com. That's personalexperiencepodcast@gmail.com. Or you can tweet me at JulesRPG, that's me, or you can tweet the show at PersonalEXPShow. This show is available on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Pocket Casts, and Direct Feed. Thank you for listening to the Personal Experience Podcast. Seek understanding, feel empathy, connect to one another. I'll see you next time.